After the previous episode in which I talked about Zone of the Enders the Second Runner, I was going to and fro with regards to what I would cover in the episode that would become this one. I had intended to cover the game that I'm about to cover, but I wanted to wait until the capture device I was after had turned up, and it hadn't until late last week, and at the time of writing the script I was not interested in waiting any further. As such, I was looking at my collection, thinking of what I should cover next, and I had a couple of ideas I could have worked with. That was until the 20th of May, however, as Nintendo did something that people don't tend to expect of them, and they released a once Japanese-only game on the Nintendo Switch's online service. Not many people, perhaps least of all me, anticipated this sort of move, largely due to the relatively niche nature of the game at this point, but perhaps bolstered by the success of Puyo Puyo Tetris and Tetris 99 on the Switch. It's perhaps fair they wanted to bring something that people would recognise, but by a different name. Enter Panel de Pon. Panel de Pon is a simple match-free puzzle game developed by Intelligent Systems for the Super Famicom, although don't let that deceive you into thinking it's a Puyo Puyo clone or a Dr. Mario ripoff. Although similar, there are a few distinctions that make Panel de Pon rather unique, as we'll discover in time, but for now, it's worth considering a couple things here. Firstly, this game was released in 1995, when the Super Famicom was at the height of its popularity, as this and the previous year saw blockbuster games such as Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger and Tales of Phantasia come out for the system. Now, comparing this game with those is a bit strange perhaps, but there is a reason for this. Games were becoming increasingly complex, and the earlier games I mentioned were proving to be very expensive. For example, Chrono Trigger, if the back of the box is to say anything, released with a retail price of 11,400 yen, which today is around 11,900 yen, or a little over $110 or £90. In fact, games such as Tales of Phantasia and its successor of a sort, Star Ocean, had extra processing chips for stuff like audio, and the ROMs were of a pretty hefty size as well, which naturally drove up material and manufacturing costs. By comparison, Panel de Pon released for a relatively meagre 5,800 yen. That's near as makes the difference half the price. So what do you get for such a comparatively cheap game? The copy of the game I own is a touch battered, but is still structurally sound. The front of the box features the standard Nintendo cover art principles of a header and a footer, with the logo for the game at the bottom. Adorning the cover are a couple characters, one in the foreground and another in the background, with a collection of coloured and embossed tiles filling out a wooden playing board. I don't generally care about cute stuff, so this sort of thing doesn't really affect me, but at the very least it does look cute, so at least it has something going for it for someone out there, I'm sure. The back of the box is a little less flooded, but it still makes good use of the space to clearly lay out information. Although I do somewhat wish there was a better colour for the back, rather than this weird cake batter-like yellow. Still, the important stuff stands out, so whilst I'm not a fan of this colour choice, it at least does help with conveying information. Speaking of, there's a fair bit to unpack here. There's a fair bit of text here, so I'll display the translated forms of this next to the relevant areas to illustrate what these are for. Either way, there's a fair bit of information here. Within the box is a standard issue Nintendo Super Famicom cartridge receptacle, along with a manual and a quick reference card, so let's have a look at all the papery stuff first. The reference card here gives you a very simple rundown of the controls, and it also tells you about the blocker panels that are available in the Versus mode, but that's for a little later on. For now, the manual. Here's the full manual, and I'm gonna be blunt about this. I don't like these poster style manuals, or at least I don't like them when they consist of as many folds as this does. It makes rearranging and putting it away difficult. Besides, I've always thought of a booklet as being a better means of conveying information quickly, rather than having a manual being delivered to you via an Ordnance Survey map. Also, this is damaged slightly. Granted, it's not like I'd be able to read much of it, and it's far from the worst condition I've seen a manual in, but it does suck nonetheless. Let's have a look at the cartridge. It's a usual Super Famicom cartridge, so let's just tear this apart real quick. Okay, you see the real reason why it's so comparatively cheap. There's only 2 chips, a couple resistors, and 1 capacitor. These consist of the D411B lockout chip and the game's ROM chip, both mounted onto an SHVX1A0N30 PCB, with 2 18,000 ohm resistors and a 22 microfarad 6.3 volt capacitor. At least I think the resistors are 18,000 ohm, I never did take up electronics. Anyhow, it's about time we shoved this thing into my Super Famicom, so let's give it a whirl. Upon booting the game, we are greeted with a rather chirpy voice and a nice poppy intro screen. So far, the impressions are that it's rather nicely presented. But let's get going into the menu and dive right into a game. We have a veritable set of options to choose from, but we'll stick with the one-player endless mode for the moment. Set it to normal difficulty, and away we go. So to start out simply, the playing field is an ever-rising wall made of rows of tiles, with the objective being to eliminate these tiles in rows or columns of 3 or more of the same tile. To do this, you must use your cursor to swap the positions of tiles left and right. You can only swap them left and right, not up or down, so be sure to use your better judgment when it comes to where you position your tiles. To eliminate tiles, simply place them to make a row or column of 3 or more of the same colour tile, and you will score a few points and have some breathing space. If you don't have many tiles on your wall, or at least not enough to eliminate them, you can call for more to pop up immediately by pressing the shoulder buttons instead of just waiting for them. Now if this is starting to sound awfully familiar, then there is likely a good reason for it, which I will touch on at some point later. But for now, know that the game is relatively simple to play but also pretty difficult to master. In endless mode, as the game progresses and you clear more tiles, the game speeds up and the tiles move faster. To alleviate this, you can stack up combos of eliminations, or eliminate more than 3 tiles in one go, either as a T-shape or cross, or as more than one column of tiles. This allows you to stop the tiles for a few seconds to get your bearings, but don't get too used to it, as at high speeds it will only be a mere pittance by the end. Still, it's nice to have. In a way, I liken this more to a fighting game helped by the versus mode the game features, on top of the fact that the game markets itself as an action puzzle game. My comparison will make more sense in time to come, but for now, that is how I see it. Oh, and speaking of see, perhaps I should talk about the graphics and, really, the general presentation of the game. I think in order to do this I should break down the actual visual style, as well as how the visuals feature in regular play. Stylistically, it's a very cute and poppy game with its visual style. The characters, being fairies, have very unique appearances, and each have their own environments with each's own details. Theana, the forest fairy for example, has a large number of trees in her stage, whilst Flare, the fire fairy's stage, is very thematically appropriate, complete with a ton of lava and a nice heat haze effect. It sort of reminds me of the battle backgrounds in Earthbound. For certain, there are plenty of details in the background as well as unique borders for the tile wall. It's a very aesthetically pleasing game, I would say. As far as the presence the visuals have in regular play, there are a fair number of pretty neat details, such as how nicely animated the tiles are when they pop, and the details in the background and even to the sides of the tile wall are all pretty nice to look at. If there's one problem I have with this however, it's that whilst the fairies themselves are cute and look pretty good, the problem I have is that I don't think they're as dynamic as they probably could be. Perhaps I'm asking a little bit too much from a game that's more budget oriented than most of the time for the system it's on, but I would have rather liked to have seen the fairies be a little more animated when you do stuff. There's also probably a technical reason for it that I'm largely forgetting, but nonetheless, it does look a bit odd when the background elements are a little more animated than some of the foreground. Though I do suppose an argument against that might be that it might be more distracting, since you're not likely to focus on background elements but instead on the foreground, and with puzzle games you want to eliminate distraction where possible, but I would still have liked to have seen that. Also, one weird thing that I noticed about this game is how in endless mode, when you score 10,000 points, the game gives you a sequence that rolls in a way that shows you the ways you've scored points. But then the Nintendo logo comes up at the end and the game is effectively soft locked. No amount of controller button pressing can progress you, meaning you have to press the reset button on the console to restart the game, but at least you still get the high score that you accrued. So now that I've played the Endless mode, what other modes are there that we can play? Well, there are 4 other modes that we can play, and I'm going to talk about 3 of them in pretty much one go, because they're not super different from what we've already played. The 3 modes we'll talk about in this section are Score Attack, Stage Clear, and Puzzle. The reason I say they're not much different is simply because they take the Endless mode and make them endless-less, if that makes sense. Let's start with Score Attack. The basic premise of this is that you are given 2 minutes to score as many points as you possibly can. You are given the option of which character to play as, and which difficulty and speed level you want, but if you want a genuine shot at a high score, you need to be well into the green zone with the speed level at least. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not very good at this mode. It's very difficult for me to be quick enough and clever enough to use everything and score 2,000 points. The most I tend to get is around 1,600 or so. Like I say, I'm not great at this game. Next up is Stage Clear. In this mode, your goal is simply to eliminate enough tiles that all the remaining tiles are below the goal line. The game's structure is one where you play through each character's level 5 times in order to move on to the next one, with the game speed increasing each time. There's no difficulty select, so be prepared for later levels to take multiple attempts. There's also a special stage where you play in something resembling a boss encounter and you have to get combos and so on to eliminate the boss's health bar, but the game moves so quickly that I simply can't keep up. As I mentioned earlier, I'm still pretty bad at this. It gets difficult on later levels because of how fast the tiles can be, and when combined with my frankly slow brain, it's a surefire way to ensure that I don't end up beating this thing. And last up in this section is the puzzle. In this, you have a set number of moves and you have to use these moves to clear all the tiles within that move limit. Puzzle mode is very much the opposite of most of the other game modes in that your only limit is how many moves you make, and the X and Y buttons have some utility in allowing you to reverse any of your previously made moves. Throughout the first 30 puzzles or so, it's relatively simple and you can get by without much issue, but once you enter Elias's world and do her puzzles, things get complicated very quickly, coming to a head in Flair's and Seren's stages. That said, it's not as though any of these puzzles are particularly harsh, just increasingly complex. If you had the mental capacity, I'm sure you could solve these in reasonably quick time. The game even gives you a prize for beating all 60 levels, a passcode that, upon entry, brings you to a new set of 60 puzzles. They really gave you a lot to do in this mode. Oh, and speaking of passcodes, if you noticed earlier there was no battery on the PCB, meaning there is no way to actually save your game's progress if you decided to, say, do something else for a while. In its place is the password system. Thankfully, it's nowhere near as egregious as the password system afforded by older games, which required 20 or so characters for a password. Instead, you just need to enter 8 characters and you're away. Now, again, it's a budget title, and even though battery saves were starting to become a touch more common by this point, thereby reducing the cost, I suppose the ultimate cost-saving measure Nintendo elected for was to use as little PCB as they could, which is fair enough. For what it's worth, I'm kinda spoiled. I never grew up having to use passwords and always relied on batteries to do the work for me. Granted, batteries can sometimes fail, but I'm a bit too new school to get on with passwords. And that is one of the very few times you will ever hear me calling myself new school. Let's talk about the audio in this game. I think this one's fairly easy to explain, and I will start with the sound effects, then the music. During gameplay, the sounds of the cursor being moved around, the sounds of tiles being switched or dropped, the especially poppy sound of tiles being eliminated, and so on and so forth, are all pretty much on point. It's some very effective sound design with no really intrusive noise. On top of that, for each character, when you score a combo or a chain, the character you play as will say something and it sounds surprisingly clear. It's a nice touch, but Seren's Ojo-sama laugh is giving me conniptions just thinking about it. And now the music. The music was composed by Masaya Kuzume, who does not appear to have much songwriting credit outside of this game, mainly because his work is more towards sound design in general than it is towards music composition. In saying that, what is on show here is generally speaking pretty good. I won't go so far as to say it's one of the best soundtracks on the SNES, but the instrumentation sounds pretty high quality. My favourite track in the game has got to be Flair's theme. It's a driving, heavy track with a hell of a bass in the background. It fits the theme pretty well, and I just love how the track sounds. Conversely, however, there are times where the music can sound a bit clunky. Take Seren's theme, where the music is supposed to sound mysterious, but the way it sounds doesn't really give it that impression. It sounds a bit like awkward tracker music. On the whole, I can't say I'm in love with the soundtrack, except for Flair's theme. It's far from a bad soundtrack, don't misunderstand me when I say that. It fits what it's going for, but save for one track in particular, I'm not in a hurry to revisit this soundtrack, to be honest. Now we're going to talk about what I think is the true draw to this game. We talked about the endless mode, the score attack mode, the stage clear mode and the puzzle mode. But now we have Versus mode. Versus mode is a straight up battle between two competitors, in this case myself and the computer. The way Versus mode works is a tad more complicated than any other game mode, but I will try to break down the rules. To win the game, you must overrun your opponent with tiles and blocks until they hit the top of the tower. All the while, tiles fill up the tower from the bottom at an ever increasing rate. In order to overrun your opponent with blocks, you need to score combos and chains, but you'll also have an extra type of tile at your disposal, the surprise tile. Eliminate surprise tiles and you'll give your opponent some heavy metal poisoning. The blocks aren't permanent, however. If you eliminate tiles and those tiles are in contact with the blocks, you can neutralise the blocks and turn them into regular ordinary tiles for your own personal use. This game mode is so much more fulfilling to me than any of the other game modes because it feels like I'm challenging someone, even if it's just a computer opponent. You select your difficulty and you're introduced to Lip, who goes and meets her fellow fairykin in, I assume, a test of faith or something. You do battle with 8 fairies of different domains, and if you beat them, you get to recruit them to your cause, some of them only really appearing in the Versus mode and not any of the other modes. Once you beat all the fairies and have them with you, you make your way from the clouds to Death Mountain, where the evil monsters lurk, starting with Phoenix. Before you do battle, however, you get to choose which fairy you play as, but note that it's only really a cosmetic change. On normal, Phoenix might be the first proper stumbling point for you. In recording this, I was fortunate in beating him before he was able to beat me, though I seem to recall having struggles against him in the past. Nonetheless, I survived, so onwards to the dragon. The dragon is no pushover. He is quick with his moves and is able to make things especially difficult for us. It took me a little while to defeat him, upwards of 20 minutes, but we do eventually defeat him. But for as hard as the dragon might be, very little will prepare you for what's next. Thanatos. The weird bastard love child of Thanos, the King of the Cosmos and Brian Blessed. This game's big bad, Thanatos, is diabolically difficult. He takes no prisoners and is ferociously quick and clever in how he plays. He also makes a very strange noise when he gets combos and so on. It's odd. I don't know how to describe it, but aside from his weird noises, he's incredibly tough and I didn't have an answer to him for over 45 minutes. Thanatos is utterly brutal. I'm thankful that I was able to get at least a little bit lucky and beat him in the end, because good lord is this difficult. When he does finally go down, he goes down in a blaze of inglory, and we ultimately end up with another credit sequence. In writing this review, I also discovered that there was a super hard difficulty setting for this mode as well. I don't know what exact differences there are in this, because quite frankly, I was not about to try this on account of my unwillingness to even think about the difficulty. I did check out someone playing through it, marvelling at how they're just that much quicker than I am, but also in awe at the fact that Thanatos is not the big bad in this game. That distinction goes to the goddess Cornelia. And she has the Ojor-sama laugh as well. Dear God, why? Now, before I give my closing remarks about my opinions of this game, I'm going to go into one thing that you may have expected me to cover already, but I decided to leave it this late on account that I figured it'd be better to leave it this late. I mentioned earlier, whilst introducing the gameplay, that the game may be somewhat memorable to some. Earlier I compared the game to such games as Puyo Puyo, but there is one other game that you could compare this to. Enter Tetris Attack. Tetris Attack released in North America in August 1996, and a few months later in Europe. It's a game that styles itself after Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. So much so in fact that the fairy characters are replaced with characters from Yoshi's Island, like Yoshi himself, Lakitu, Bowser and so on, with Yoshi's stage being quite different in design to Lip's stage design, both visually and in terms of audio. Much like how Puyo Puyo was westernised as Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine with Sonic stuff, Tetris Attack is somewhat similar to Super Mario Bros. 2 in terms of how it presents itself. A non-Mario game sporting a Nigel Mansell moustache. Everyone knows at this point that the Super Mario Bros. 2 that we got was basically a Mario'd up Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic, and we wouldn't get the actual Super Mario Bros. 2 until it released as Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. The difference here, however, is that in the case of Super Mario Bros. 2, that was based on the franchise Nintendo themselves developed. Nintendo at this time did carry permission to use the Tetris name, and they decided they would try to one-up one of the biggest selling versions of Tetris by releasing a spin-off styled after a Mario game. Clever idea for success, no? Well, Nintendo may have thought about it as a smart idea, but Henk Rogers, one of the founders of the Tetris company, saw it slightly differently, stating that he regretted allowing Nintendo to have the naming license for a time. This is of course despite him liking the game anyway, but given how radically different it plays to any Tetris game, and it's hard to mistake a full-blooded Tetris game, the fact the game carries a name belonging to a franchise it does not play like is somewhat deceptive. Amusingly enough, Tetris Attack released in Japan as Yoshi no Panepon via the Satellaview BSX add-on for the Super Famicom, simply being panelled upon but with Yoshi plastered all over it. The game is also impossible to re-release in the West today, on account of the fact that it uses a name Nintendo no longer owned the license to. Somewhat like Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! However, as I mentioned already, Nintendo recently released Panelled Upon via the Nintendo Switch Online service, and it's certainly not something I expected to happen anytime soon, but the game's release on the service is my main reason for covering it right now, because Panelled Upon is trendy again. So in conclusion, Panelled Upon is a very good game. Very good. I'm just bad at it, and I likely didn't give this game a good enough showcase. But this isn't the kind of game that I play all that often, and I've only played so much of it, not like 50 or so hours of it. The game isn't necessarily rich in content, but what content there is so addictive that it doesn't necessarily matter. It's a fun game which challenges you to want to play it more and see what you can do with it. I can definitely see myself returning to this game more in time to come, especially as this is aged like a fine wine. Now, two final things I want to cover with this game. Its importability and its language requirements. Oh, and other releases in games that I haven't mentioned yet. As far as importability is concerned, there are a fair number of eBay listings for the game, and copies of the game are reasonably cheap, with Yahoo Auctions listings between around 1,000 to 2,000 yen, though the nature of these being auctions mean the prices will fluctuate a bit. Honestly, I would say it's very much worth importing if you like puzzle games. If you want to see what this game was like before Nintendo decided to completely change it, why not try it out? In terms of language requirements, this one's a little tricky. I'll simply say this, if you can read and work out what's being written in katakana, you should be okay. If you struggle with that, you might have difficulties guiding yourself around this game. There is also the issue that pretty much every bit of text that isn't written in katakana is instead written in hiragana, with some key words coloured in to differentiate it in lieu of kanji not being able to be displayed for the size of the text. I'm not saying you need to be JLPT N1 certificate holder for this, but I do think it should be okay if you can read the characters and understand what they are trying to say to some degree. I'm missing out on some of the dialogue, for example, but I can read much of the key parts of the menu, so that's helpful. As for other games, this game would lead to a franchise coming out of it called Puzzle League, with the next game being based on Pokemon, being released as Pokemon Puzzle League for the Nintendo 64 and Pokemon Puzzle Challenge for the Game Boy Color. In 2003, a Japan-exclusive collection of Nintendo puzzle games consisting of Pon de Pon, Yoshi's Cookie, and Dr. Mario would release on the GameCube called the Nintendo Puzzle Collection. A similar compilation consisting of Dr. Mario and a simplified version of Pon de Pon, having been stripped to its base mechanics, would release on the Game Boy Advance in 2005. The next game would release in 2007 on the Nintendo DS as Pon de Pon DS in Japan, Puzzle League DS in Europe, and Planet Puzzle League in North America. A simplified, smaller version of the game would release as DSiWare in 2009 called Chotto Pon de Pon in Japan, a Little Bit of Puzzle League in Europe, and Puzzle League Express in North America. The most recent game in the series is actually a mini-game found in another game, namely Animal Crossing New Leaf, for the Nintendo 3DS, as Animal Crossing Puzzle League features in the game's Welcome Amiibo expansion. Despite how relatively simple the game is, Nintendo managed to work wonders with it in terms of how they managed to make the game's play in so many different ways, despite the limited content. The best part about it is that it makes battling against someone via puzzles pretty fun, even when it was only against a computer and not another person because I'm lonely and we're in the middle of a crisis right now. But anyway, I think I've gone on for too long now. Pon de Pon is a very solid game that I recommend everyone tries out at some point in some way or another. In fact, if you are a Switch owner and have online access, which I don't, you basically have little reason not to, all things considered. It's a really good game that I'm really not good at all, but that's fine by me. I had quite a good time playing this. In the next episode, I will be talking once again about mechs, but this time I'll be covering something a little more uncharacteristic, based on the developers who made it. In the meantime, if you want to let me know what games I should or could cover, let me know in the comments. My VG Collect is also down in the description, and my Twitter link is there if you want updates on whatever is going on. As ever though, this has been Daniel Learmouth. Siddhi.